Hey, Mon-Chaio, what's up?
Hey, Andy. So we finally have a name for our podcast, I believe, or at
We
least a
do.
tentative name.
Yay! Yay!
Exciting stuff.
It is exciting.
So I think what we should say is welcome to the TTL podcast, right?
The TTL podcast, the Tactics for Technical Leadership.
Right.
Because we want to talk about technical leadership, technical being software development. Hey, we're all in the tech business. And tactics, because we thought, well, actually what we need to do is we need to make sure that we're giving specific advice. What can you do? How can you actually do leadership in a tech organization just a bit better?
Yeah, absolutely. And, I feel like we're, given our experience and whatnot, we're and sort of maybe our unique point of view in a way. I think this will be interesting. So, let us know if you like the name, if you hate the name, if you like the initials, TTL. But yeah, we're open to comments.
Excellent. And you teased them a little bit with our experience. You mentioned that. I think in a later podcast, we should talk about our experience. Why should anyone listen to us? Not quite yet. Keep listening. Eventually, we'll talk about that. Hopefully very soon, so that you'll keep listening.
I think people should listen to us because they should, right? Tautology.
Oh, yeah. It's a good idea to listen. There you go. All right. So today I wanted to talk about, Mon-Chaio, looking at situations in an organization, looking at the dynamics of teams and how they operate in the way that you want, or how they operate in ways that you thought that was not at all what you wanted to happen, and why that might be. Now, what I find useful when doing this is thinking about a particular model of analysis or behavior, because that gives us a way of asking particular questions, a way of structuring our inquiry into what's going on here, and bringing to mind things that maybe you wouldn't immediately think of. So we're gonna try that out. You think we can do that, Mon-Chaio?
Yeah. I mean, and honestly, I do think that this is a super interesting topic. I'm glad, in fact, that we're covering it sort of episode 2, if you will, because I just feel like some of the biggest problems in our space, in our industry, does have to do with group dynamics, right? And people often don't think of that. They immediately go to processes, or they go to personality fits or whatever. But
or just the code is suck. You've got this technical debt, and that's why we can't do anything. It's the technical debt.
Absolutely. So I think absolutely this is a great thing to talk about. So I think we both, in preparation for this, ended up reading about one particular type of model that we thought might be an interesting way to analyze it. Do you want to kind of talk through that a little bit?
Yeah. So it is called the BART model. Now, to throw some jargon at people, it's a BART system of group and organizational analysis. It's created by something called the Tavistock. If you have any background in the psychology disciplines or sociology disciplines, Tavistock is a name that will come up quite often. They're well known ever since the 60s or before. And what this is it's the model that they use in their group dynamics seminars. It's the way that they analyze groups. The BART is not the train line in San Francisco. That would be kind of cool, but it has a different meaning here. It is boundary, authority, role, and task. And the idea is that when you're looking at the dynamics of a group, internally, this is a fairly important thing, internally, people have their understanding of what the boundaries are they're working within, what their authority is, and what other people's authority is, what their role is in any given situation, and what the task is that they're there to actually perform. And what you do in the analysis is you start asking a bunch of questions of nothing all that structured, but questions about these ideas. So for instance, you might ask, what authority is being exercised by this individual or this team or this organization? And how did they get that authority? Mm-hmm. Is it formal? Did someone with other authority grant that authority to them? Or is it just that we all assume they have that authority? It's kind of informal authority. We just all let it happen, which isn't bad. You just need to understand it's there.
Right. Absolutely.
What's the boundary? A boundary could be about time. Well, this thing happens. The task is operating within a particular time bound. It could be geographic. We're talking about just this office versus that office, and those are their boundaries. It could be something actually related to the authority. What's the boundary of that authority? Where do they have authority and where do they not? Can also be part of boundary. Role is kind of like, what is your job description? What is your informal job description? Those kinds of things. And then task is, what is it you're trying to do? Quite often it will be something about, well, make the business money. But the task more immediately is often, well, what is it that this project is trying to achieve in order to make the business money? And so that kind of very simple framework that just opens up a bunch of words for us to think about can be really useful for analyzing a situation.
Yeah, I agree. I think frameworks are a really great way. At least for me, I like using frameworks. Maybe it's just the way that my mind works. And putting words that everyone agrees upon what those words mean to describe, certain pieces of analysis, I think is super important.
Yeah.
I'll tell you, Andy, to be honest, like when I was reading this paper, it felt a little, what's the word I would call it?
Academic.
Dry, academic. Academic and dry don't necessarily have to go together, but I felt like there was a lot of jargon and I felt like there were a lot of words. But having finished it, I did like draw back to my own experience about something that had happened. And I think it would be interesting to explore maybe how the concepts that were presented in this paper may or may not be able to help us analyze what went well and what went wrong in this specific situation.
I'm an optimist. I think they'll help us.
Okay. So let's give that a shot. Let me try sort of laying out the situation, and then we can sort of talk through it.
All right.
Does that sound good?
Yeah, I'm excited. I'm interested.
All right. I'll start off by saying that this situation happened at a company which very much values what they would call bottoms up leadership, bottoms up innovation, bottoms up participation. So what does that mean? That means, unlike some software companies I've worked at in the past, the quarterly planning or the half planning or the year planning isn't just a bunch of stuff that comes down from project management PM org. And then the engineering org says, okay, well, you've already rank ordered all of these things. So like, let me figure out how I can fit them into X, Y, and Z. This company very much valued that list actually come from individual engineers that were an individual PMs working with those engineers that talk to customers every day, that build stuff every day, which I think is a very, very laudable goal. So I'll just set the stage there because, again, different types of organizations with different cultures will have a different sense of like how they should operate or what's broken versus what's not, right?
Yeah. And
All right.
in this case, they wanted that autonomy of decision. They wanted, you guys know what's going on, so tell us what needs to happen.
Right. And I think the other important thing to bring up is that because it was such a big part of their culture, they hired for that. And people that go into the companies end up expecting that and wanting that. The company itself also made it very easy for people to transition between organizations. And so what's interesting about that is if people did not find that they were autonomous or that they had bottoms up leadership or any of the other things which they might be unhappy about, they could very easily move,
Right.
without any sort of career cost to themselves. So that's sort of the context of the company. Now, why don't we talk about the context of the specific situation within the company? So the company itself had a product that was a consumer product. That consumer product had been in the market for quite some time and was fairly successful, lots and lots and lots of different users. And as a product of that scale, that org was divided into various different supporting orgs, right? So there was like the UI layer for that product. And I should mention that this was a mobile first / basically a mobile only product.
Right.
And so there was like the UI layer, the app layer, there was like the iOS group, the Android group, and then there were various platform groups that supported it. Without getting into too many details, there was like platform group A that handled one part of the platform to support that product, platform group B that handled another part. And so that was a pretty autonomous organization that built that product. At one point in time, company leadership decided, well, you know what? This consumer product, or at least the bones of this consumer product, would be super interesting if we would apply it to the business context. So instead of a consumer product, we have a B2B product that we can then sell.
And you said the leadership decided that. Was that from the top, or was that something that was decided or suggested from the bottom?
No, that's a good question. No, in this case, it was from the very top.
Right. Okay.
And you might say, well, how does that jive with sort of bottoms up leadership? As we all know, not everything can come bottoms up, right? Otherwise, what is your CEO supposed to do? Sit there and just wait for bottoms up ideas, right? So no, this directional setting, which is exactly what I think engineering executives should be responsible for, did come from the top.
Right. I often see that kind of thing, to a slight sidetrack, is that you think about, you want to incorporate the information across that whole structure. And so you want both information from the bottom, information from the top, information from the middle, and you need to kind of bring it back and forth across all of that as it kind of, you try to figure out like, okay, how does this fit together? Does that take us in a direction that the company needs, which is usually what the people at the top really should be understanding? And then is that taking us in a direction that we can do is really what the people at the bottom should be understanding? And then you kind of have to put it together and say, yes, we can do it and we need to go there. Excellent.
Yeah, absolutely. Part of that side tangent is I think one of the most important skills for leadership that people talk very little about is being able to make sense of many disparate signals, vague signals, irrelevant
Mm,
signals, and putting them together into something that makes sense and is quote unquote valid for the time and space that we are today,
yeah.
right?
And then telling that story so that people can believe it's valid.
Oh man, telling that story is going to be its whole separate series of podcasts, I think. Don't even get
Excellent.
me started on telling stories. So important in every role. All right, but getting back to what we were talking about today.
Back to your story.
Right, back to my story. Okay, so the leadership decided that they wanted to use the bones of this consumer product in the business space. And of course, in the business space, think about like a company like, I don't know, just any company, Microsoft or whatever. People aren't using their mobile phones, right, at work all the time. They're on their desktop machines. And so it was important that this product now be migrated or segmented off to desktop, which had never been done before, right? So in service of this, obviously they created a different org, right? It was an org that was specifically focused on business use cases for this product. There wasn't a deep tie into consumer at all. In fact, it was really thought, well, I don't know that they're really going to share any of the same UIs, right? One's on desktop, one's on mobile, different paradigms, but definitely the bones or the platform parts of the product would have to be shared. So we'd have to use some of the consumer parts of the platform. We might copy some of the code, we might call into some of the APIs, and then, of course, there's desktop specific stuff that have to be built on the business end. And so that got kicked off. It's a completely different organization. Like I said, different reporting structures, right? Different roadmaps. Totally made sense. So that came up, that started going for a little bit. And then
And
leadership
and
decided.
and and I just want to clarify something really fast. Sorry to
Mhm.
interrupt. When you say that that went off rolling, it sounds like, and I just want to check this. It sounds like that at the engineering level, you had these organizations, you had the people writing the UIs, the people writing the platform, and that they almost had this agreement of we're related but separate. You're going to use part of the platform, but you know what? Fork it if you need it. If you need to make changes, we're going to be doing our thing. You're going to be doing your thing. Let's just kind of keep an amicable but separate relationship. Is that about right? The way that they were thinking about it?
Yes, absolutely. And I think there's a slight nuance there, which again will tie back to what we're talking about in the BART model. That is how and I think many people would read the situation, but that was never really explicitly stated,
Ah,
right? But that was, in fact, how those two groups were operating. We'll help as much as we can, right? But it's clear that, I don't know, from the consumer side, your business use case is so small. We have so many users. We're focused on our users. And from the business side, at that point in time, well, we're not thinking about consumers at all,
right.
right?
So it was never explicitly stated, but a lot of people assumed that their boundaries didn't really overlap. Their
Correct.
tasks were separate. It meant that they had separate boundaries. They didn't have authority over each other. No one was
Correct.
like, you need to do this because you answer to me. From the BART perspective, they were kind of separate universes. At least that's the way they thought they were. And because I think you're foreshadowing something here.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, I am foreshadowing something, but yes, absolutely. They were basically separate universes. And I like the fact that you use this idea of boundary and authority because I think those will come into play very strongly as we talk about what eventually happened here.
Okay, yeah.
So it was, they went off rolling. Like you said, the end orgs and the product orgs for the various groups, they kind of didn't talk much to each other. They'd reach out and be like, hey, can I use your API here? Oh, it doesn't quite do this. Can you make it do that? Generally, the answer would be, well, no, our customer base is a lot larger than yours. So why don't you come in or why don't you fork it or why don't you X, Y, or Z, right? Interestingly, however, at some point, as the business product was progressing, leadership again took a look at it and said, you know what? This would be very interesting in the consumer space as well. There's no reason that this just has to be a business product. There are many times when consumers are not just on their mobile device. Sometimes they're on, desktop devices, right? And so let's make this broader. And so the org that was building the business product ended up taking on the consumer aspect of this, primarily because they had the expertise in writing desktop software, and this was going to be a desktop product.
Okay.
Right. And for anybody that's written mobile versus desktop, you will probably know it is quite different to develop across those platforms, quite different. And so it became sort of a tech, sort of tech center of excellence type of thing where like, okay, you have knowledge here.
Right. You guys were
So
already
go do it.
writing a desktop. We want this for consumer now. So how about you take over writing the consumer desktop?
Mhm. And so, then of course, the PMs on this previously business side of the organization now started to think about what are the unique consumer use cases on the desktop side. And then they started prioritizing those. And they still had to think about the business side of things. And so this product ended up being built up that way. At some point, and this is, I think, hopefully where we can start to do the analysis and ask questions around that. At some point, here's where this product and this org ended up. This product ended up almost a year late in shipping, extremely buggy insofar as I would say somewhere near 60% to 80% of all tasks coming in were bugs that were being
Mm,
reported and had to be fixed.
interesting.
And there was a lot of attrition, mass attrition from this group, previously the business desktop application, right? I'll just start calling it the desktop application for now. And the other one I'll call the mobile, right? Because now they're not business consumer focused, they've sort of morphed, right?
Right.
So this desktop application group is now attriting like crazy
Right.
and morale is low.
And do you know the reasons why people are leaving? And like what are people complaining about at that point?
I don't think there was any formal analysis done around why
Mm,
specific people were leaving. I think there were some conversations around it. And I mean, as you leave orgs, whether you go to other companies or whether you go to partner orgs, you always know not to burn bridges, right? And
yeah, yeah.
so you get these answers like, oh, it doesn't fit sort of my career aspirations, or I have a buddy working in this team, or things like that. There were some more honest answers that probably came out more in like one-on-ones and like,
Which is normally where those will come from. The exit interview is, yeah.
right. Yet another topic on like whether exit interviews are ever reasonable to do or helpful, I should say. They're always reasonable, maybe not helpful. So that's the state, right? And so, product late, many bugs, and mass attrition.
Is there some sort of like dispute going on between requests? Like I guess what kinds of bugs are these? Are these like poor engineering practice, or are these like we don't understand what we're building?
Mm. Most of the bugs were actual bugs. They were things like the product isn't working as expected. Where as expected, I think was very clear. Well, as expected was clear insofar as for a polished product, this would not expect to be the case. So, for example, I clicked a button and I didn't see a response from the UI for 5 seconds.
I see.
Right. Things like that. There definitely were some sorts of bugs. And again, foreshadowing here, which were around, hey, when I do this on mobile, it works. But when I do this on desktop, it doesn't.
Right.
Or when I do this on mobile, this is the behavior. When I do this on desktop, the behavior is slightly different.
And why was that? Why do you think that was happening?
I mean, they're different code bases, right? They didn't share code.
Right. Okay.
One example would be like there was this database that stored the number of times something was seen. And that database didn't exist at the platform layer on the mobile product. It existed in call it the app layer. And so then on the desktop product, it had to exist on the app layer as well. But the logic was different about how it stored those numbers or how it incremented those numbers.
Right. So let me get to I think the crux of like where you might say this is a problem that's occurring. And then I think once we've got that, then the analysis can start happening. I think, let me get this right. I think that you said it when you said that they don't really share code. I'm guessing they don't really share platform or infrastructure either. They're not collaborating to create a unified product. They're trying to like copy each other. Is that about right?
Interestingly, yes and no.
That
So,
makes it even more interesting.
right. So to talk about unstated expectations or agreements.
And the reason, okay, so I've been going for this. I've been looking for what's that unstated agreement, because in the BART model, so much of it is about making these things clear and explicit. And I've been trying to dig for where is the uncertainty? Where are they unclear? For instance, on the boundary, one of the things the paper says is that the boundary has to be, it's crucial that it's clearly specified. Clear specification of time, task, and territory boundary should answer these questions: when, what, where. So they really need to know what is their boundary, and it has to be agreed upon. All the parties involved need to agree. It says, although a
Absolutely.
boundary may be clearly outlined, invested parties need to come to some agreement about what the stated time, task, or territory boundary is or how they interpret it. I think that how they interpret it is very important.
Right. And I think probably not surprising. A lot of the paper talks about making things explicit, right?
Yeah.
Similarly, on the authority side, right? And we'll get into this later, but clearly defined authority that's taken up accordingly and accompanied by tools to exercise it. So being very clear about what things are and whether you can and have the materials in order to do it. So these unstated sort of assumptions, you're right, are very tricky. And yet, I feel like every place I've ever worked, there's probably been more unstated assumptions, even around this idea of BART, than clearly stated assumptions. Would you agree in your experience?
Oh, I think so. Yeah. Yeah. The like, yeah, generally just kind of take care of this thing, Andy. And I'm like, what does that mean?
Hmm.
What does it mean to take care of it? What's my authority over it?
Well, maybe towards the end we can start talking a little more abstractly about why do we think that is, and do we think that's a good idea, and how do we change that?
But let's stick to your example for now. So,
Okay.
so thinking about boundary, because we did talk about this a little bit before we started sitting down and doing this recording.
Right.
Just to break that fourth wall a little bit. Yes, we do talk about this beforehand. It is not completely off the cuff. Last time when we were talking about it, it became very clear that you almost had these two boundaries of the consumer system and the commercial system, the business system, which then, as you said, they kind of got combined. But when that combination happened, there was never any clear discussion about, okay, what are the boundaries now? Are you completely combined? Are you really just the same group now? Are you
Hmm.
just collaborating on this one little piece?
Hmm.
Is that your only overlap?
Hmm.
And because those boundaries weren't ever discussed, neither side, neither of these original orgs that we now don't know what state they're really in. Are they one org? Are they not? It's unclear.
Hmm.
Didn't know if they were sharing authority, if one had authority over the other, or vice versa. And
Hmm.
so, if I recall correctly, a lot of these bugs were kind of coming from the team saying, "No, look, that's still not our priority. Go away and work on it yourself." Is that right, or am I misremembering?
I don't know if that's exactly right, but other than what you just said around go away and work on it yourselves, that's not our priority. I agree with everything else. Let me sort of throw another wrench into the works, something we
All right.
haven't
Yep.
discussed.
Yep.
At one point, the consumer org was approached and said, "Look, like we're going to the consumer world with this desktop application. Like, don't you think that it fits into your world?" And the consumer org, or the mobile org, basically said, the mobile consumer focused org said, "That's interesting, but we don't really care. You have no users. You have a lot of complexity. Building desktop apps requires building its own, build system, for example, requires its own debugging system with memory management and whatnot. I mean, there's just like those use cases that you have are interesting, but like we're really busy with big numbers right now."
Right. Basically, that's really cool, but we don't want to do it.
Hmm. However, what that org did care about was interoperability, right? So if a feature shows up on the mobile app, it's a very jarring experience for it to be completely missing on the desktop app.
Oh,
Or if a
interesting.
bug is fixed on the mobile side, oh man, this button doesn't turn red when it's supposed to. It's really supposed to turn red. It needs to be fixed on the desktop side. To your point around boundaries, you're right that the boundaries were, the mobile side basically said, "Look, the boundaries are separate, right? We're separate boundaries. I don't care about your thing." But interestingly enough, when we get to the authority, they certainly thought that they had some authority.
That's what I was thinking.
Right.
But if you then go to the T, the
Hmm.
task,
Hmm.
they've rejected the task.
Hmm.
They have, it sounds like, explicitly said that's not our task, but they want the authority.
Right. Or at least this is super interesting. I think within the realm of BART, I would absolutely clearly call it they wanted authority. Authority as a word, though, often, feels very authoritarian. And so, if I were to go back in time and I were to ask these folks, "Hey, do you want authority?" Their answer would not be yes, right? They would use, in business speak, couching the language, "We want influence. We
Yeah.
want negotiation," or the magical word, "We just want to collaborate to do what's best for users."
Yeah. So in the paper, they say, we define authority quite simply as the right to do work.
Hmm.
Now, the work that they wanted the right to do in this case was not the right to do the work of the desktop app development.
Hmm.
They wanted the right to do the work of almost product management, but only portions of product management. They didn't care about all of
Correct.
it, but they did care about certain aspects. And they believed that they had the authority, or at least wanted to have the authority, to do
Correct.
that portion of the work.
Correct. Absolutely. Or to influence that portion. They didn't want to do it.
Yeah, yeah. But well, to influence it, to do certain aspects of it, because it sounds like they wanted to say, I'm gonna hold pretty firm on this. I think it's they
Mhm.
wanted to do a portion of the product management work, which was to define this feature needs to go in now. This feature needs to go in now.
Right. Okay. You're right. That is fair. Yes, that's true.
And at the same time, and this is where the whole thing starts getting a little wobbly,
Hmm.
they rejected the task that the desktop app was really a priority to do.
Correct. Yes.
Which then now we're sitting here like, okay, so they're kind of unclear what their boundaries are.
Hmm.
They don't want the task, but they
Hmm.
still want the authority.
Hmm.
And they probably have no recognized role in how this is all
Hmm.
supposed to play out.
Hmm.
So I think I can understand how this got very contentious and maybe why people decided to leave. It was probably unclear most of the time who they should listen to and what they should be working on.
Right. Absolutely. I would say if you dug into sort of the next level of details about what people left, the informal conversations around it, you heard a lot of we're not in control of our destiny.
Oh,
Interestingly enough, in the BART paper, I read about, they talk about the survivorship task. Is that what it's called? Let me just
let's do a quick
look it
little
up here.
search.
The survival task. So
Ah.
we can edit that uncertainty out if we want, or we can leave it in. In the BART paper, they talk about the survival task, right? This concept that regardless of what the formal or informal tasks are, there's always this unspoken task where a group wants to live.
Yes, they want to
And
continue existing.
right. And I would say that they want to thrive, would be the other part that I would add to that. And I think really that was the crux of a lot of the attrition. When your boundaries are unclear and you don't feel like your authority is clear, it's very, and then your tasks are unclear. It's very difficult, I think, for people to feel like their groups can survive and thrive. Now, we can always ask the question, does that group deserve to survive or thrive? Or are groups even important? And like, is survival of one group important versus survival of another group? And I do want to get into this a little bit later, this mythical just collaborate through it type of thing.
Mm-hmm.
But what Bart would say, and I tend to agree, I don't know if you tend to agree, I tend to agree that regardless of what you say from the top, there's this human instinctual nature of belonging and survival. And so
Mm-hmm.
if you're part of a group, you're going to want that group to survive.
Yeah.
And when you don't feel like that group is surviving, you're going to jump ship to belong to a different group.
Yeah. And the paper even goes into the dynamics that play between the survival task and other things. And they give names to two other tasks around the survival task. They have the primary task, they say
Mhm.
also referred to as the functional task or work task, which corresponds with the mission of an organization. In this case,
Mhm.
the primary task would probably be somewhere along this line of like creating this thing for desktop.
Right.
Or creating
Right.
this thing for mobile and desktop.
Right.
The survival task is when a group works on a task, members of the group always, albeit mostly unconsciously, very important, it's mostly unconscious, have the survival of the group in mind. We call this the survival task of the group. The primary task and the survival task coexist. At times, the survival task is in service of the primary task and complementary, but mostly it is in conflict with the primary task. And so that survival task of the group, they want their group to continue, can bring them in conflict with whatever it is they've been tasked to actually do.
And I love the fact that the paper calls out that it's almost always in conflict. I think that is so important.
Yep. And then their last form is the process task. And the purpose of the process task is to give attention to the survival task without necessarily acting it out.
Mm-hmm.
So it says it provides an opportunity for members of a group to look at their own dynamics, including dependency, pairing, fight, flight. Ooh, I'll get to that in a second. And oneness behavior, issues of competition and authority, interpersonal relationships, trying to understand the meaning of behavior of an individual for the group or group behavior as such. Basically, what they're saying is there is another task that goes on, which is almost like how this group operates. And that's actually, you could say that the way the group operates is what the group is, and that how they operate is in service of their survival task, not in service of their primary task. Because
Right.
to do their primary task, they might have to do something completely different.
Well, and I want to get to because I don't think I've heard your thoughts around the fight flight and that sort of stuff. So I want to give space for that. It's interesting though, because when I read about process task, I immediately thought about retrospectives.
Yep.
And isn't it funny that so many companies' retrospectives deal with the primary task? Oh, did we ship the product on time? What could we have done to have fewer bugs? Versus really talking about group dynamics and their survival task, which is what Bart would say, your retrospective should maybe primarily be about.
I think this is an interesting one, and maybe something we should talk about even more in another episode, about the
Hmm.
role of retrospectives and those process ceremonies
Hmm.
and how they play out. My understanding is that they would say that the act of doing that is going to be, no matter how you do it, it's a survival task.
Oh, interesting.
Because even though you might talk about that primary task,
Hmm.
the act of doing it is about creating that group, about maintaining that group. In fact, that's often one of the reasons you do retrospectives, is not actually to find those process improvements or what do we do next. It's to create that sense of belonging.
I hadn't thought about it that way before. I think that's super valid. That's a really interesting way to think about it. I still do think that maybe one of my learnings is that maybe the retrospective should focus a little bit more explicitly on survival tasks as well.
Oh, I think so. So I know someone who often complains that retrospectives get cut short. And the person, it's Steve
Ti-
Freeman.
Okay.
Steve
Time
Freeman would,
boundaries?
yeah, Steve Freeman would often complain to me, yeah, about the time boundary. Like a
Uh-huh.
retrospective, it gets put in your calendar as this meeting that'll be 30 minutes long. And what often happens, and you can watch this, maybe you've even noticed it. The retrospective starts happening. People like write up their post-it notes or whatever it is you're going to be doing. And at first, they are talking about that primary task. They're talking about, oh, this bug got through. How could we prevent that next time? Or I'm spending
Hmm.
so much time on code reviews. I need to spend more time on understanding what we're building.
Hmm.
As you get to the end of the meeting, people then start opening up about how they're feeling about the work. And then usually just a few minutes later, it's like, oh, time's up.
So the most interesting parts that take a lot of time and trust, building a safe space or whatnot to get to, ends up being the stuff that's cut at the end.
Yeah, yeah. And it's like, we're just getting to the interesting stuff. No, just let
Hmm.
it keep going.
Hmm.
Because generally, those things will actually even start answering, why are you behaving this way on your primary task?
Right.
But they're uncomfortable because they do take
Right.
that place of vulnerability.
Well, and that's why it takes time to get there, right? Like you
Yeah,
don't all get into a room and just say, okay, let's start talking about vulnerable stuff. Like we still
yeah.
have other meetings on our mind. And yeah, I mean, Bart even talks about that. Like meeting ceremonies should naturally address boundaries, right? There was a
Hmm.
boundary of your last meeting. And to close that boundary, let's give it closure by talking about it so that we can fully focus on this boundary.
You were talking about these groups and their kind of interactions with each other, and we got
Hmm.
to this point where they kind of have these survival tasks that are starting to happen, starting to take
Hmm.
precedence in conflict with their primary task, which was to ship this software.
Right.
Survival tasks are often, according to this paper, the source of off-task behavior.
Right.
So they say off-task behavior can be distinguished in 4 categories: dependency, pairing, fight, flight, or oneness. It says in group relations terms, these categories are called basic assumptions. Dependency is when the group waits for one person to take leadership, as if other members don't have those skills. So
Hmm.
that shows up when they start looking towards like their manager and saying like, you need to sort this out, man.
Right.
So if you ever see that happening on your own teams, start thinking, why do we have this dependency behavior going on?
Well, and I
Um,
can say in this particular case that absolutely happened.
yeah, hey, good.
Hey, we have these weird like mission conflicts, like, and part of it was, the leadership on the desktop side volunteered to be the people to sort it out.
Yeah, yeah,
Right. They saw that as their primary mission, the most important thing. But then that caused everybody else to kind of see that dependent behavior and be like, well, I can't really move in any
yeah,
meaningful way. I mean, I could still do work, right? I'm still
yeah.
working.
Yeah. Well, since I have, if I was an engineer on those teams or someone, and I have now ceded that authority to
Hmm.
address any of these issues to the manager, I've
Hmm.
created that dependency.
Right.
Well, I shouldn't take it back.
Hmm.
So I'm now waiting for them. I'm now stuck.
Right.
And then the next thing is, and I can imagine it happened in this group, you might not know, or you maybe do know, is pairing. Pairing is dependency of a slightly different sort. It's basically saying there's a group of people or a pair who somehow have this magical insight where they can come up with the solution,
Mm-hmm.
and we become dependent on that pair to work it
Mm-hmm.
out for us. And the way they say it is, pairing is when the group uses a pair to produce the solution in the form of a prophetic idea or person. Oftentimes this happens in the form of a fight in which may eventually result in some solution.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe it's like, hey, manager of the desktop app and manager of the mobile app, you guys just get in a room, fight it out, come out with the oracle's saying on what we're supposed to do here.
And how doesn't that happen all the time in these collaboration models,
Yes.
right? And the other example I see a lot of that is the EMPM pair. They're the prophetic
Oh, yeah.
problem solvers, right?
Yeah. The engineering manager, project manager, product manager.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, they often get paired up and be like, oh, you guys need to be the oracle for everyone.
Right.
And organizationally, we even set that up
Mm-hmm.
to kind of fall victim as an entire group to this survival task.
Absolutely.
And then continuing on with these things, we got the pairing, the fight or flight, which is fight is when the group starts to conflict about relatively inconsequential things. They probably had all sorts of little fights about things that just didn't matter.
Mm-hmm.
Tabs versus spaces, possibly. And flight is when the group either literally or metaphorically distances itself from the task, for example, by members starting to take personal phone calls during a meeting, or by entering into fantasy land and thinking about the next dream vacation, or literally flight and just leave.
Mm-hmm.
You can imagine. And oneness is when the group acts totally undifferentiated, as if there is no difference of opinion, let alone conflict within the group.
Right.
I would see that. I would expect to see that in a group that has a strong consensus culture. They would get so consumed about this oneness that we are a group, we are in consensus, that they would probably start finding it difficult on how do we deal with this conflict.
Well, I think there's also the other part, and maybe this is that fight flight thing also, but I've definitely seen groups where you give up that higher level thinking and you only focus on sort of that lower level thinking. So you say, well, there's all this conflict. We don't know what to do. The feature that I was doing got canceled, or the feature I suggested was not prioritized for unknown reasons to me. It wasn't well explained. I'm just going to be heads down. I'm just going to focus on my work. And I'm
Yep.
not going to think about this other thing. And I think that leads to oneness as well.
Yeah. It could be oneness, or it could be the a form of flight.
Mm-hmm.
You kind of in avoidance behavior.
Right.
I'm not going to deal with the fact that I have no clue why I'm working on this. I'm just going to work on it.
Yeah, I think, and maybe this isn't what the paper means. I feel though it does manifest itself in oneness a lot, where it looks like the group is all in agreement because nobody
Mm.
is. It's not that nobody's bringing it up; it's nobody's even thinking about it. They have avoided it so much that they
Yeah.
only focus on things in which they can agree to
Yeah.
as a survival. Well, these are all survival tasks, right? But as a survival mechanism,
Yeah. I would say I don't see any reason that these can't be combined,
right?
that you can't be doing several of these at once,
Right.
especially within a group of multiple people.
Mm-hmm.
We've talked through the whole situation.
Mm-hmm.
So what's the summary? Where have we gotten? Has this BART thing helped understand this a bit better?
I think it has for me. I think way at the beginning, we talked about having terms to put to use, right? And so I've discussed this situation with a number of people in various successes of understanding or misunderstanding. But I think part of that problem was having the right terms, right? And so I think, yeah, using terms like boundary, authority, role, and task make it very clear what you're talking about and to help diagnose the situation. And I think that it's also helped understand why things might have gone so wrong, right? I think it's very clear, at least to me, that the boundaries were unclear. And let's go back to something that you said in the paper, which I really, really liked. Around the explicitness of the boundaries. Were the boundaries clearly specified? Were they agreed upon? And were they adhered to? It's very interesting. I would say that maybe the first two were actually true, but the third one was not. And so then I would say, well, were they really agreed upon, or were they only agreed upon, in spirit or by fiat or whatever, or whatever,
Yeah.
or clearly defined by spirit or fiat or whatever?
Yeah. Were they agreed to simply to avoid conflict?
Exactly. And so I think, there were definitely boundary issues here. Clearly, I think those boundary issues led to authority issues. And then, of course, the unclearness of the task I think is prevalent throughout this example. So I think that actually, I don't know if you agree, but I think that gives us maybe a framework for how to avoid these situations in the future or improve these situations in the future if it comes up. What do you think?
Yeah. I think absolutely. Next time it comes up, just thinking about like, okay, what am I seeing happen here? Can I explain it through boundaries not being clear? And then if it's happening at the time, we would actually have the advantage of being able to go and ask people, what do you think your boundary is?
Hmm.
Whereas right now, I can only interrogate you. But if it
Right.
was happening in a group around me, I would be able to say, okay, what's the boundary going on here? Or what authority do you think that person has?
And what do you think, having asked those questions and gotten those answers in real time, then what?
So then this goes to a thing that I believe about organizational setup and design. It's about alignment.
Mm.
It's not to say that I'm right and they're all wrong,
Hmm.
but it's to get to that agreement about, okay, what do we agree about the boundaries? What do we agree about the task? Actually, I'd probably start with the task because everything
Hmm.
else is really going to start flowing from that.
Hmm.
What's our primary task? All right. What are the boundaries that make sense to achieve that? What
Hmm.
are what is the authority you need to achieve that within those boundaries? And those
Hmm.
will play between each other. And then do you all have the right roles to actually do all of this? And then kind of like through that, build that alignment about how is this all set up? And probably ideally even write it down. Say,
Hmm.
this is what we've agreed. It may be wrong in the future when we've learned more about the situation, but at least we can go back and talk about it in the future, what we think we agreed. So I would say that it gives us that structure to identify, diagnose, and then correct.
So, Andy, I have one more question for you. Speaking of these agreements, do you think that there needs to be some sort of minimum time that these agreements or boundaries need to live, or do you think they could change sort of willy nilly according to your needs at the time?
Ooh, I think there's a lot to discuss there. I don't think we have time this episode. So maybe the next one.
Yeah, I think I tend to agree. I think it would make for a fascinating topic all on its own. So why don't we put a pin in that? Let's do our next episode just on boundaries, how big, how small, can they change, how often, and maybe what the tax of those changes might be.
Sounds good to me.
Well, and I guess this kind of is a natural end here. We hope you've all enjoyed listening. We'd love your thoughts if you have any. Let us know if you found BART useful to successfully diagnose challenges in your own organizations or your own teams.
All right, Mon-Chaio. See you next time. We'll have another interesting discussion.
Absolutely. Take it easy, Andy. Good talking to you, as always.